Before Israel saw a champion, they heard him. Every morning the valley carried his voice like thunder over stone. His name was Goliath. To the Philistines he was a weapon. To Israel he became a wall nobody knew how to climb. Men who had survived battles now lowered their eyes. Swords remained in their hands, but courage had drained from their faces. This was not just a battlefield, it was a mirror, and every man in Israel was being forced to look at his own fear. King Saul stood taller than the men around him, but on that morning, even a tall king felt small. Across the valley, Goliath did not need to swing his sword. His words had already wounded an entire nation. 40 days passed like this. Morning after morning, evening after evening, the giant returned, and fear returned with him. But far from the shouting, far from the armor, far from the eyes of kings, God was preparing someone nobody expected. His name was David, and before he ever faced a giant in public, he had been trained in silence. By the time the sun rose over the camp, fear had already awakened first. It sat beside the soldiers before they even touched their shields. No man wanted to be the first to say it aloud, but all of them were thinking the same thing. If the giant steps forward again, who will stop him? They were trained for war. They knew how to strike, defend, and survive. But none of that had prepared them for a man who could crush courage before the battle even began. When Goliath appeared, he did not look like a man. He looked like the end of hope wearing armor. The valley had heard his challenge many times now, but repetition had not weakened it, it had made it worse. Every insult from his mouth landed like a stone, not on their bodies, but on their faith, their pride, and their memory of who they were. Even the men who once told stories of victories now kept their mouths shut. Fear has a way of erasing yesterday's courage. And Saul, the king chosen to lead them, could feel the eyes of his nation turning toward him and finding no answer there. A throne can make a man look important, but it cannot make him fearless. So the army waited, not for orders, not for strategy. They waited for someone else to do what no one among them believed they could do. But deliverance rarely enters a battlefield the way men expect. It does not always arrive on a war horse wrapped in bronze. It may arrive carrying bread, cheese, and obedience, wearing no crown, no armor, and no sign that history is about to change. David did not enter the story like a warrior. He entered it like a son obeying his father, with dust on his feet and food in his hands. Behind him were the fields of Bethlehem. Before him was a valley where grown men had forgotten how to breathe. He was not looking for greatness, he was looking for his brothers. Around him, armor clinked, fires burned low, and soldiers whispered with a kind of fear that tries to hide itself. Then the camp changed. Men who had been standing suddenly turned. The air tightened. The valley had spoken again. David heard the giant before he saw him. Not every word reached his ears, but the poison in the voice did. He watched trained soldiers step back from a voice. He watched shields lower before a sword was ever raised. To them, Goliath was the problem. To David, the silence of God's people was the stranger thing. He had come carrying bread, but something deeper began to burn in him. Not pride, not anger, but a holy refusal to let fear speak louder than faith. For the first time in 40 days, someone in Israel did not measure the giant against himself. David measured the giant against the God who had seen him in the fields, the nights, and the places nobody applauded. And before David ever picked up a stone, the battle had already begun inside him. David was about to face Goliath, but first he had to face something quieter. The kind of rejection that comes from people who think they already know you. His brothers had seen him with sheep. They had seen him with bread. They had seen him as the youngest, but they had never seen what God had been building inside him. To them, he was still the boy left behind in the fields, the boy sent to watch animals while real men stood near the war. But sometimes the people closest to your past are the slowest to recognize what God is doing in your present. Eliab, his oldest brother, looked at David and saw interruption, not courage. pride, not conviction, a child, not a calling. And there, in front of the soldiers, David learned a truth every chosen person must learn. Before a giant questions your strength, people may question your motives. David did not answer like someone trying to prove himself. He answered like someone who had already settled the matter in his heart. He did not carry a sword. He did not wear armor. He had no rank to protect him. All he had was a memory of God's faithfulness. The others remembered what Goliath had said. David remembered what God had done. That is why his courage looked strange to them. It was not born in the noise of the camp. It was born in hidden places. Hidden places do not look important when you are in them. They look ordinary, repetitive, forgotten. But heaven often begins its greatest stories in places no crowd would ever choose to watch. While his brothers learned the rhythm of marching feet, David learned the rhythm of silence, danger, prayer, and trust. So when Eliab saw a younger brother asking dangerous questions, God saw a servant stepping toward the moment he had been prepared for. David was not offended enough to quit. He was not intimidated enough to hide. He simply turned from the voices that doubted him and kept listening for the voice that had called him. Long before the valley knew David's name, the wilderness knew his footsteps. There were no trumpets there, no soldiers, no king watching from a tent, only sheep, stones, wind, and silence. But the hidden field was not empty. It was a classroom, and every quiet day was teaching him what noise never could. He learned to notice what others ignored: the broken branch, the restless sheep, the shadow that moved where no shadow should be. A shepherd who sleeps through danger loses what was placed in his care. So David learned watchfulness before he learned warfare. He learned responsibility before he touched a battlefield. Then one day, the lesson stopped being quiet. A lion came from the hills and seized what belonged to the flock. In that moment, David had a choice: protect himself or pursue what was taken. There was no army behind him, no brother beside him, no one to tell him he was brave if he survived. Courage is different when nobody is recording it. It is purer there, more costly, more honest. David struck the lion not for applause, but because the lamb mattered. And when the field grew quiet again, David did not become famous. He simply carried the lamb back. Another day, another danger came. This time, heavier, closer to the ground, a bear from the wild places. Fear visited David more than once, but every time it came, it found him guarding what God had trusted to him. The wilderness was not making him loud, it was making him steady. The same hands that played songs in the dark learned how to fight in the dust. God was teaching David that faith was not a feeling for peaceful days. Faith was what remained when teeth, claws, and darkness came close. So when David later stood before Saul, he was not telling stories to sound brave. He was remembering evidence. Word of David's questions began to move through the camp faster than he did. A shepherd boy had asked what soldiers were afraid to answer. Soon the boy who had arrived with bread was brought before the king, who had run out of answers. Saul looked at David and saw the obvious: youth, softness, inexperience. Everything about him seemed too small for the shadow standing in the valley. But David did not bring Saul a theory, he brought memory. The kind of memory fear cannot easily erase. He remembered the lion, not as a legend, not as a story polished for important ears. He remembered the weight of the lamb in his arms. He remembered the bear, the breath in his chest, the ground under his feet, the moment fear came close enough to touch. David was not saying, "I am strong enough." He was saying, "I have not been alone." Saul heard the words, but he still trusted what kings often trust: mettle, rank, invisible strength. So they dressed David like the kind of warrior everyone understood. But what looked impressive on Saul looked impossible on David. The armor did not only weigh on his shoulders, it asked him to become someone God had not trained him to be. There are battles you cannot win while wearing someone else's calling. David walked out of Saul's tent with no armor, no royal weapon, and no human explanation that made sense. But he walked out carrying what the field had given him: trust. David left the tent lighter than he entered it. The armor stayed behind. The fear stayed behind. The need to look like someone else stayed behind. Around him, men trusted bronze. David trusted what had already been tested in lonely fields. Then he turned toward the stream. Not toward the blacksmith, not toward the weapons rack, toward water, earth, and stones. The stream did not look like a place where history would bend. It looked ordinary, quiet, easy to overlook. But David had learned that God often hides weapons inside ordinary things. One stone was not desperation. 5 stones were not doubt. They were preparation. He was not trying to impress the army. He was choosing what his hands already knew. A sword would have made him look stronger to men. A sling reminded him who had made him strong when no man was watching. From the ridge, soldiers watched him. Some saw foolishness. Some saw courage. Most could not tell the difference yet. Saul had offered him what looked safe. David chose what had been proven. Before the valley heard his voice, David let silence settle inside him. Then he rose with 5 stones, 1 sling, and a piece that made no sense on a battlefield. When David stepped into the valley, the sound of the camp seemed to fade behind him. Every step separated him from the safety of the crowd and brought him closer to the fear that had ruled them for 40 days. From the Philistine side, laughter began before understanding did. They saw no armor, no sword, no reason to be afraid. Then Goliath saw him, and for a moment, the giant did not look threatened. He looked insulted. Goliath had expected a warrior. Israel sent him a shepherd. But heaven does not measure a man by the metal on his body. Heaven measures what has been formed in him when nobody was watching. The giant's voice rolled across the valley again. This time, it was aimed at one man. The same words that had emptied soldiers of courage now struck David and found nowhere to live. Fear had ruled the valley because everyone had treated Goliath's voice like the final word. David answered with the calm of someone who knew another word had already been spoken over him. He did not deny the sword. He did not pretend the spear was small. He simply refused to let weapons define the outcome. The giant came with the weight of iron. David came with the weight of remembrance. He remembered the field, the lion, the bear, the nights when no one came to help and God still did. To Israel, this looked like the worst mismatch imaginable. To David, it looked like another moment for God to be known. Then something changed. David did not wait for the giant to close the distance. He ran toward him. Not because the giant had become smaller, but because faith had become louder than fear. And as David reached for the first stone, the valley held its breath. David's hand found the stone before his fear could find a voice. The weapon looked small enough to ignore, but in trained hands, small things do not stay small. Around him, the valley became a blur. Soldiers, banners, armor, fear, all fading behind one act of obedience. Then David released what the wilderness had taught him to trust. For 40 days, Goliath had filled the valley with his voice. In one silent moment, a stone answered him. The giant staggered, the valley froze, and for the first time, the thing everyone feared began to fall. When Goliath hit the ground, it was not only a body that fell, an entire lie fell with him. Israel saw the giant on the ground, and suddenly men who had forgotten courage remembered how to move. The valley did not become holy because the threat was gone. It became honest because everyone finally saw what fear had been hiding. David did not become brave in that moment. The moment only revealed the courage that had been formed when no one was watching. The field had trained his hands, the silence had trained his heart, and the giant only exposed what the wilderness had already built. And that is the lesson of David. God often prepares a person in silence before revealing them in public. The valley only shows what the hidden place has already made.